the Budget Committee of the Maury County Board of Education. First item of business, we need to adopt an agenda. We received a proposed agenda that everyone's hopefully had an opportunity to review. Are there any changes, or is there a motion to approve? Motion to approve. Second. I got a motion by Mr. Moore and a second by Mr. Pennings. And before we take that vote, let's let the minutes reflect that we have committee members, Ms. Parker, Mr. Pennings, Mr. Moore, I am present, and Ms. Powers is present. So we do have a quorum of the committee. And then also, if the minutes can reflect, that we have Ms. Morency, Ms. Kinzer, Mr. Beaver, and Mr. Atkinson, who's attending by video conference from Arkansas right now. So also have him in attendance. All right, so with that, we do have a motion on the floor to approve the agenda. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, we're ready to vote. Ms. Shirley, if you can reflect me as being a yes on that. What was the vote, Ms. Shirley? Five to zero. Okay, so that motion does pass on a vote of 5-0. Okay. All right, so that motion does pass. Also, we have a set of minutes that you all received. Are there any changes to the minutes? If not, is there a motion to approve? All right, got a motion by Mr. Pennings. Second by Mr. Moore. Any discussion on that motion? All right, seeing none, we're ready to vote. All right, so that motion does pass on a vote of 5-0. All right, so now we're ready to get into our new business. You all will recall from our meeting on Tuesday, we do have some business to finalize. And maybe just to help to recap things, Mr. Parliament, if you can pull up the master spreadsheet that we've been working with. All right, so if we go to the top, we can see the current draft budget that we're working on as far as total revenue is $98,254,797. Have a little bit of interference. And then if we drop down to the bottom line as far as expenditures are showing $98,764,414. So we have a difference of, and I think, Mr. Parliament, you have at the bottom, we'll get our technical difficulties figured out here in a moment. All right, so Mr. Parliament, the bottom line there, if maybe you can blow that up a little bit on column F, we've got an overage of $509,000 to figure out. And so that was kind of where we ended the discussion on Tuesday. We've got to figure out, do we go back and adjust revenue? Do we adjust expenditures? What do we do in order to balance the budget? Okay, so let's do a little bit of a recap of what is contained in this current budget. If we can look at Mr. Parliament, I think you've got a summary of the budget increases of what is contained. And this is just Mr. Parliament, my understanding, this is just a rough summary or overview of what's contained in these increases in budget expenditures.
That's correct.
Okay. So what we're currently looking at are the key items that's what's contained in the keys budget. And there's an itemization of those needs, and that's around $1.4 million. Contained in this budget that we're looking at right now is almost $1 million in step raises for our employees. And then the current draft budget that we're looking at right now, we're looking at trying to fund additional increases to our employee salaries of 3%, and that will be an impact of around $1.85 million. Is that correct,
That's
Mr.
correct.
Parliament?
That's correct.
Then also, it looks like we have some other instructional staff needs, which are around $478,000. Then also, we've had some growth that has occurred, and as far as covering those increased positions, my understanding it's around 16 additional positions that we would be including in this budget, and that's a total impact of around $1.2 million. Am I correct so far, Mr.
That's
Parliament?
correct.
Okay. We've also, as a committee, we've looked at providing some additional funding for nurses. It looks like we're looking at trying to fund an additional full-time nurse and 4 part-time nurses, and that's a budget impact of close to $100,000. Then also we're looking at adding some buses. I think, Mr. Parliament, maybe you can speak to this. Are we adding? Okay. Looks like maybe my battery went dead or something, so we'll do a little switch over. All right, so my understanding is with the additional bus drivers, these are the actual driver part, the buses themselves would be in our capital budget. But this is to add 10 new drivers and 2 attendants. That's going to be a budget impact of around $269,000.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, I think initially, Mr. Parliament, we were looking at completely or pretty well eliminating the walk zone.
That's correct.
But then we've went back and we've made that where there's still going to be a half-mile walk zone?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So that had an effect of 2 drivers.
Okay. So has that number been adjusted, that 269?
Yes, it was originally a little over 300,000 with 12 drivers.
Okay. So right now the budget impact will be around 269, and that's to reduce our walk zone from maybe a mile and a half. And I think we've looked at that there's not very many counties that have a mile and a half walk zone. So that would be an additional amount to our general purpose budget of around 269. And then also we're adding administrative staff in the amount of 108,000. And my understanding of that is regarding the digital person that would be coming in to cover that. Is that correct? Okay. And then health insurance, it's like everybody else, unfortunately, health insurance costs are going up, and we're currently projecting that the impact on our budget is going to be around $820,000.
That's correct.
Okay. All right, so that's what the budget that we have right now. All those things are in there, including a 3% raise. But in order to get there, we've got to do some figuring on how to get there.
Right.
Okay. And so I guess in summary, some of the things that we're looking at, we may not necessarily do a 3% raise. We could reduce the amount of the raise. We could probably make our budget balance in that respect, because I think from going from a 2% to 3% is roughly how much, Mr. Parliament?
About 660,000.
Or 660,000.
616,000.
Okay. All right, so that's one possibility that the committee could study. Another possibility that the committee could study is to go back to the revenue side of things. So, Mr. Parliament, if you can pull up the master spreadsheet again. All right, so we could go back up to those revenue lines, and we could set our revenue for local revenue. We could increase some of those things to try to balance the budget.
That's correct.
Or we could make some cuts from other budgets. So those are all kind of the options that we have. Now, when we left the meeting on Tuesday, what we asked was that the superintendent's office look at seeing if we can balance this budget by finding cuts. And I think you all have gone through that to try to find some cuts. Now, part of, just as an update from our meeting on Tuesday, initially we thought we had about a $600,000 hole to fill, but you've since, Mr. Parliament, I guess, went back and looked at your math. We were kind of doing things on the back of the napkin, I guess, on
Correct,
Tuesday,
right.
but you've went back, made sure what the exact number is, so it's really about a $500,000 hole that we're trying to fill.
That's correct.
Trying to figure out. Okay. So that's where we're at right now. I guess, Mr. Superintendent, your office went and looked at some different things that we might do as far as if we made some cuts. And let me back up just a little bit. I guess of those three options we talked about, we could do a combination of those options. We could go back and look at the amount of the current proposed salary increase. We could look at a combination of doing some increases on the revenue and doing some reductions. So it's not necessarily an all or nothing type approach. But
Yeah.
with regard to the potential cuts, so if you could go over that with us, Mr. Superintendent.
Yeah, so there were things that, through the KEYS process, one of the things that I talked to you guys about last year is, if you want to fund additional things, you have to look at other things that are taking place in the district and kind of make the decision whether or not we want to swap things out or whether or not we would just want to go back to the county commission, just ask for additional revenue, because this is all about furthering the KEYS. This is all about those things that schools, that principals and teachers are asking for in order to push these initiatives in their schools. It's really unfair to ask teachers and principals to make growth without additional resources to have what they need to push forward. So we have a recommendation tonight that we believe will balance out this budget that will send us off to the county commission. So our recommendation is, when we look at the growth of teachers in the BEP, they're saying we're going to need 16 teachers, but the word is not when we will need those. Highly unlikely that we're going to grow that large over the next 2 months as parents moved in the district. We may not even need those positions until December. So that right there is enough. If we take it all the way from August to December, that's a savings of over $500,000 right there with a $1.2 million increase from the state of Tennessee. So our recommendation in working with Betty Kinzer is, let's use that money to balance the budget, and then we're done.
So are you saying, how many teachers you want to hire? 8, 16, 12, or none?
Well, it's going to depend on the growth and when those students kind of trickle in and come in. We don't think that we're going to get, like 45, 50 students at one school on August the 1st. They're going to trickle in over time. It may be where we need somebody around November or December or maybe even January. We have that money. That money is sitting. And if we don't hire a teacher in August, that money just sits there, and then we start paying them as if they started day one working in January. So that money is available, that money is sitting there, and working with Ms. Kinzer, I propose that we take half of that money for the extra employees, and we apply that towards balancing the budget.
Okay, my other question is, and I don't see Mr. Perryman here, but if we change the walk zone where we need 10 more bus drivers, do we have to get approval from the county first to buy new buses, or do we have enough buses to do that right now?
No, sir, the buses to fund that are included in this year's capital fund request for buses. So we would need additional buses.
Fund request, but it hasn't been approved yet.
That's right. Yes, sir, that is correct. It is in what's included in the capital request.
Thank you.
Ms. Kinzer.
Let me be clear. Are we going to budget just for 8? Or are we just simply going to take out of that line item in what we discussed, the 500 and something thousand?
I would recommend we take out of the line item that exact amount that we need.
Okay.
And I think we're going to be okay. I don't think we're going to have an influx of students in the spring semester, which is going to require us to hire 8 teachers off the bat. I think we'll be okay.
One of the reasons that Dr. Marzak and I discussed was the fact that these students have been here all year. The fact that ADA is up, that they're here, they've been here. And so the BEP says that we can justify that many extra teachers and use BEP money to fund them. Teachers have worked it. They really have given them a quality education. So I think we could certainly make it through the first of the year and maybe not at all need them. So this is a cut we can make, I think, without taking anything away from the students we're trying to provide the
Agreed.
best education for.
Agreed.
I'm not a member of the committee. I can't make a motion, but I would hope someone would.
Agreed.
Mr. Moore.
I know in the previous meetings we've discussed how we have refined the budgetary numbers for salary and for all of the payroll staff. Is this the only growth of teacher addition we've budgeted in, or is it also included somewhere else?
The growth number that you saw on the GP increases included the 4 related arts teachers that we were adding as well. So it's the 4 plus the 16.
So this
That's
is
how
the
you got
only
to the
place
new-
we're actually accounting for adding new teachers as students roll in at random times throughout the year. And I guess the only problem I've had with this, and I've been going on about this for a couple of weeks, is getting to a point of accurate budgeting. And I'm really nervous about not, if we think we need a certain number of teachers that are going to be added to the year, from a budgeting standpoint, it makes sense to me to go ahead and budget for that. And I understand we're trying to fill a hole here, but I'm trying to stay consistent on what I've been saying all along. If we know we're going to need something every year, we need to go ahead and budget for it. So that makes me a little nervous to start taking away this. And I understand that we may not need them, and that's the reality of any budget. It may not work out exactly like what we're doing. I'm just not sure about that. That's where I'm at.
Does this have any impact on class sizes?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do we have any increases in educational assistance and things like that included in the budget? Additional educational assistance?
I think there's a few, according to the enrollment numbers, that are projected, but there's not a large number.
Well, I'm just going to tell you, I went through the budget today, and in the instruction line, I found $245,000 difference between the educational assistant number for last year versus this year. Is that...
Some educational assistants in the past were educational assistants, but they were being used as clerical personnel. So what we tried to do is by roster, when we looked at the roster, if they were being used as a clerical personnel, we moved them. So where you see that reduction, that's in the office of the principal. So we tried to move them and get them in the right place. So you'll see an increase, I think, in office of the principal, where we moved
An
those
increase
people.
or a decrease in office of the principal?
Let me look at the budget with you.
Okay.
Hang on a second. Well, if you could switch over, we can see the budget, and look at there, 77,100. So from 16 to 17, you're saying this is where we increase.
It's the 240.
Okay, now let's go to 2410. You should see where we decrease 240.
There's a reduction in clerical personnel.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
But
So
the
we
different-
just, yeah, we just
Okay.
tried to make sure that they were in the right place.
Okay.
That's where it is. So
That
it's the same
difference,
amount.
it's not the same amount.
How much is it different?
I mean, I'm not sure, but I know it's not 245 when I do quick math.
It's about 175.
Okay. That's in one line item. And then if we go into special ed, same thing.
Okay.
So there's a lot of things that when you
Let
start
us wait
going
till we
through
talk to
some of these
special ed.
numbers, it's just not adding up for me, guys. I mean, I'm just not clear where y'all are getting increases in numbers and then telling us that we've got to cut all these other things. It just doesn't make sense.
Let me get in.
Didn't Lisa add
If you look at the 71,200 special education line items, yes, I am asking for an increase in educational assistance.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. That's direct, that's to the point, that's the question. So I just don't like it when other people are telling me that they're not asking for an increase in educational assistance because it's clearly the numbers don't match up in instruction and the clerical personnel. there's an increase there. So, I mean, it is what it is. And we can do this all night. I don't really want to, though.
Mr. Parliament, going back to the summary of the increases, I know that we went over that the budget that we're looking at has other extra instructional staff in the amount of $478,000. What is contained in that? Is that some of the teacher assistants and that sort of thing?
That
What
was,
is
I believe, 3 of those positions are in special ed. Is that correct, Lisa? And then there's one in the attendance area.
Okay. Well, let me, going back to the way of trying to budget the $500,000, I think it's certainly something to take a look at if we're budgeting for 16 positions. Right now, do we think that we need all those positions at this time? That makes a lot of sense to look at that. I guess what my reluctancy is, it may make sense now, but does it make sense a year from now or 2 years from now? And I'm always concerned about kicking the can, so to speak. I mean, for example, I guess what we're currently looking at as a possible suggestion would be we would reduce those 16 positions by $500,000. Now, my preference would be to just reduce the number of positions, not to reduce the budget. And the reason being is, what do we do next year? I mean, because if we haven't accounted for this now, we just kick the can until next year. And if we still have 16 positions on the books, then we'll have to add that funding at that time. So I guess that would be my preference, is to just eliminate the positions. But then I guess what my concern is, if I eliminate the positions, am I setting myself up for hard times a year from now as we start building these new schools and we have to start adding teachers and that sort of thing? Have we got ourselves in a real bind instead of like already planning ahead and already getting those positions ready so that we got a little bit of flexibility? We're going to be really tight. So that's one concern that I have, and maybe you can help walk me through that.
So really a lot rests on the approval of the capital budget by the county commission. If we don't get approval to start funding the elementary school at Malin Moore, then that offsets when we need to start looking at adding staff later on down the road. If we do get the funding, then it's going to be around next budget year that we need to start talking about adding positions, or what are we going to do to make sure that we have enough teachers when Malin Moore Elementary School opens the doors. There's a lot of mitigating factors to determine in that.
Right, and I understand that. I guess there's some things beyond our control, but it just seems like that is something that it's got to be done. I mean, we know that the growth is there. Those schools need to be built. And I guess in my mind, the scenario I'm thinking through is when you open the door at the new elementary school in Spring Hill, or if we open the door for middle school, is that we got to go from 0 to 100?
Yeah.
Or did we already kind of start planning ahead where we started, okay, we know this is coming. We're already kind of like setting ourselves a budget, getting ready for, we know that we're going to have to open the door, and we're going to have those positions, so that it's not so overwhelming at that point in time. I don't know. Again, that's just
going
me.
back to, that's one of the things that Stan and I talked about with that software program, Guide K-12, where we can start to draw those boundaries, and that'll give us a pre-notice of how many kids are going to be in the door. Do we go a little further and include this neighborhood and grab a couple more kids and maybe relieve some potential overcrowding at Marvin Wright? Those are things that we're going to have start having those discussions on within the year as we start to redraw or draw those boundaries.
Ms. Kinzer, and then I think Mr. Banks.
I just want to remind this board, as I've mentioned in previous budget meetings, that we are putting in fund balance $1,757,910 from regular instruction. We're putting in fund balance about $745,000 from education, special education, and $623,000 and change in vocational. Those are all instructional line items on which the money was not used. So I think we're safe.
I think that's a good point, but I do have to remind us on Tuesday we started out trying to fill how much was it?
1.4?
1.4 million.
Okay, so we had to figure out how to come up with 1.4 million to
Yeah.
do a 2% raise.
Yeah.
And part of that was reductions that we made of about 1.4 million plus some additions to salary. That 1.4 million that we did in reductions included about 800,000 in a revision to those salary lines to make sure that we're getting more closer to accurate,
Next
which
year.
I think is a good thing. I just a little bit worried, the closer we get it to the bone, are we leaving ourselves any wiggle room? And that's my primary concern.
But the Budget Committee voted unanimously that our employees should have a 3% raise. And we asked Dr. Marzak to come back with those figures. And yes, he did some things today we weren't very happy about because it kind of made everybody kind of, what? This is a solution that's workable.
Right.
It's doable. Certainly, if we reach that point that we may need to look at, I don't think it's going to happen. But if it does, then he'll come back to us. We'll see what we can do.
Yeah.
But I want nothing less than a 3% for our teachers. I think they've earned it. I think they deserve it.
Agreed.
Mr. Penix.
Well, I agree with both Davids, and I agree with the 3% raise. But right now, by cutting, just saying we're not going to hire these 16 teachers, and I've been dealing with the commission for 9 years. They haven't even approved building the new school yet, right? So if they approve building the new school, and we get it, it's going to be opened in 2019.
3 years.
By approving the new school, really they're saying, okay, we know you need more personnel. We just opened another school. So now 2 years or 3 years when we bring this to them, they have no excuse not to approve it because you told us to build a school.
Ms. Parker.
You mentioned the guide, K-12 guide, whatever this program is that you talked about the other day.
Yes, ma'am.
How much is the cost on that?
We haven't got an exact cost, but I think it's about $2 a student.
Okay. Is that included in our budget anywhere? Okay.
No. No, not yet. We have to, we need to do some due diligence and then bring that back to the board, decide if that's a route that we want to go down.
We just heard about it last week, first time.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just tell you, between the two of y'all make $280,000, and I want you guys to have the first crack at it before I buy any more software. That's how I
Sure.
feel.
Not a problem.
I'm tired of outsourcing between y'all, Dr. Register, EMG, all the money that we've spent, and then we just throw it away. We don't use it. So I'm tired of it. I want to see you guys do the work first. I'm not going to buy any software. That's me personally. I'm one of 11. The rest of them may feel differently, but I am not in the mood to buy any more software for this county.
Yes, ma'am. It's okay, Stan. It's okay.
Mr. Moore.
For the addition at Marvin Wright, do we already have that budgeted in for the staff increases that I'm about 99% sure we're going to need there? Or was that included in the 16 new additional people? So we've already budgeted that elsewhere.
Yeah. So we're good.
It's not included in the 16.
I don't believe so, no.
Good question.
Because, I mean, when we start cutting, I mean, again, that's where I start to get down to where it makes me nervous that we're not fully accounting for the growth needs. So that's...
Yeah, we're okay. We're good.
By good, that
At
means
least 4 more. Yes,
we've already budgeted for them elsewhere other than the
Yes.
16/8.
yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Parker's point, I think, I don't think they expect, and my own numbers say we shouldn't see all of those, all of 8 classrooms full, but I think 4 is probably pretty close there.
All right, so we've got some discussion. We got to get this figured out. We've got kind of a proposal to take a look at. We would either do a reduction of that 16 position section by enough to balance our budget, or we would eliminate, I think, probably 8 positions in order to make it work. That's something that the committee can take a look at. Another thing that we could take a look at is I had Mr. Parliament do some historical analysis as far as our sales tax a little bit more. And Mr. Parliament, if you'll go to maybe that revenue breakdown. And under sales tax, what we're currently budgeting is about 15.6. Is that correct, Mr. Parliament?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, what the 15.6, what that represents is an assumption that next fiscal year, what revenue that's going to come in is going to be roughly 5% more of what we're expecting the revenue to be this year.
That's correct.
Okay. And it appears that may be a pretty conservative figure because you've done some analysis over the last 5 years to see what our trend line is, what is our average growth, and I think over the last 5 years, doing that analysis shows that we've actually had a growth of our sales tax by about 6.5% per year.
That's correct.
On average.
The 5% was based on a 10-year average. It's a
Okay.
higher average over
That's
5
right. So
years.
the 10-year average is around 5%, but the last 5 years, we've had, on average, about a 6.5% growth.
That's correct.
So there may be some basis for us to go back to that particular item, and if we wanted to try to be a little bit more on average of what's been over the last 5 years, we could adjust that sales tax line, and that would increase, if we went with a 6.5% growth estimate for next year, that would make I think that would increase that line by about $236,000. Is that right, Mr. Parliament?
That's correct. I'd have to pull it up, but
Okay. So if we did that, that may lessen the blow a little bit. We may not have to cut as many positions. If we did that increase, I think that would leave us with, around 250?
270, yeah.
Okay, 270. And so how many positions could we get that down to maybe just eliminate around 4 positions instead of 8 positions?
A little over 4, yes.
Okay. So, and again, I'm just using rough numbers. Now, I will say, when we go back and you did some, again, provided some information over the last 5 years, that 6.5% may be a conservative figure. I think you provided me over the last, as of April of this year, based upon the data that you provided, we are currently to date about 9.2% above what we were for the year at the end of April of last year.
That's correct.
And if we go back a year before that, we actually had growth of about 11%. I think it was, looking at your data, around 11.3%.
So the last 2 years have ramped up significantly.
So, it may be that, of course, none of us know ultimately what the economy is going to hold. But looking at the trends, it looks like there's a basis to maybe do an adjustment, a reasonable basis to possibly adjust that. So that's another possibility that we as a committee could take a look at. Or again, we may just elect to eliminate all those 8 positions, or we could do some other combination. So I'm willing to open the floor for suggestions or a motion to how to proceed. Let's see, Mr. Moore?
Okay, I'm going to go back to the change in positions. Mr. Superintendent, you had mentioned just changing the dollar figure, not the actual position count. is what you're really
Either
going.
one works.
But because I guess and I think maybe this is where me and Mr. Bates are I'm coming from a different direction. The reality is, if we need 16 teachers, we're going to have to hire 16 teachers. And we'd have to find the money somewhere. That would be either pulling as a budget amendment from somewhere else or going to fund balance on it, which
Yes.
I would really not like to do.
Understandable.
So I guess that's where I'm coming at it a little differently than you are, Mr. Bates. I think 'cause what I see is that if the growth happens throughout this year and we add enough teachers, once we get past that, whatever we have funded, he's going to come back to us to find the funding because we are going to have to hire that teacher. It's not like we're not going to do it at that point. But again, more than likely you would be coming to us with some kind of amendment to move from somewhere else, not coming to us for asking for a one-time.
If we need to, yes.
If we need to.
We'll definitely try to work around and make it work. Yeah.
If that's the case, I mean, I'm still not comfortable with it because again, I think that's cutting it awful close on getting towards, again, my goal of going to accurate budgeting where we actually are projecting what we think we'll need each year.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you on that. I think that's where me and Mr. Bates do agree that what we want to try to get to is where we're looking at these things with some reasonable projections that we are going to be hiring this many teachers every year. And we need to go ahead and be budgeting for that.
Yep.
Even though we may not need the money until halfway through the year. I just want to get to that point, and I think that's where I definitely agree with him that in some ways this is kind of stepping backwards where we're not properly moving that direction where we're accounting for that money, which we know is going to keep getting to be more and more of an issue over the next few years, especially when the new schools come online. I would make a motion on this, but I'm not sure how I want to word it yet, so give me a minute to put my wording together.
Oh, I find it real hard to agree with him all the time. I agree with you too, Mr. Bates. I think we ought to leave the 16 in there and just cut the 500,000. But unfortunately, our funding body, I don't believe, are as forward-thinking as you are as far as the sales tax. And when we get the final budget to the county commission, again, and I say this every time we have a budget meeting, and it happens every time. Last year's the first time in 8 years that the budget ever went through, because the only thing they worry about is increasing their funding that they have to do every year. They don't want to increase the maintenance of effort. You can tell them, look, we're getting $3 million more in sales tax this year. Oh yeah, we know, but we're going to keep that because if we give you $3 million, we got to give you an extra $3 million next year too. To me, that's just, I may be old, but I can add up better than that.
And of course, Mr. Pennings is only talking about the commissioners not present. The ones that are present are A plus.
No, anything I say behind somebody's back, I say to their face first.
Yeah. But I think our funding body, I think our commission has come a long ways, and I think they understand the importance of education and putting education first, and I think they made a huge progress last year, and so I'm looking forward to continuing, hopefully, that we continue that progress. So I'm still hopeful. Ms. Kinzer.
Oh, just one more thing. If you whatever you do, if you keep the 16 in there, I go back to attrition. So far, it's reported at least 45 retirees, some that are licensed personnel, about 15, maybe 20 more that are non-licensed personnel. You're not going to hire the new teachers until you get some ADA figures, which will be about fall break. All right, so you're talking about an August 15th, an August 30th, a September 15th, a September 30th, in which you're going to run payroll and you're going to know how that attrition affects it. Mm-hmm. It's probably going to provide you the loss of what we're talking about taking out now. Mm-hmm. And then, once again, once you get your ADA figures, you're going to say, you know, I'm going to need someone here. Sometimes we have to transfer when we don't need one here. But I bet you don't have to hire a lot of teachers on the very beginning of the year, maybe not even till December. So I would favor, if I was a voting member of this committee, that you simply take the dollar figure out so that you could say you could hire, because you hire a teacher in December, you're paying half of what you've budgeted for that year. So if you just take the dollar figure out, I think you'd come out fine.
And Ms. Kinzer, I think you do make a good point, and I think that helps me feel a little bit better about getting things too close to the bone, and maybe there's some flexibility that if there are some retirements, that we may have a little bit more flexibility down the road. So that, I think that is a good point. So, Mr. Moore.
I know y'all are sick of hearing me talk. So functionally, what we're talking about is reducing 71,100, line item 116 by 509,617.
Is that the amount, Eric? Is that up there?
Is that the final amount we?
That's the amount that we needed. Exactly half of the 16 positions would be 520. So,
Well, I'm going to stick with the amount we needed.
okay.
Perfect. Let's go to 0.
So then that would be, do y'all want to do the math on that so I don't get it wrong? What we're reducing that line item to exactly? I'm seeing, unless, I'm seeing a 33,707, 346, and 55 cents is the line item there.
$33,197,729 is what it would reduce it to.
That would be my motion, Mr. Chairman, is to reduce that line item by that amount to get to the number he's got that I haven't done yet.
And I'll
Can I
I'll
make
add,
that any more confusing?
I'll add to that, because of the math and because of how the positions are built in, it's going to be a little bit more than that, because the 3% raise is calculated on those positions now that you're pulling out. So the amount needed for the 3% raise drops a little bit. So it's still not going to be the exact 509.
Do you see the look on my face right now?
All right, so maybe, Mr. Moore, to help things out, your motion is to make a reduction in the number of, or the budget for the new positions.
Yeah. It's just going to be the line item, which is for teacher salary position, if I'm reading this correctly.
Which will balance the budget
Yes.
based upon revenue of 98,254,797.
Yes.
Second.
All right. All right, so we got a motion by Mr. Moore. We got a second by Mr. Pennings. Any discussion on that motion? All right, seeing none, we're ready to vote. All right, so with that, I think we now have a balanced budget to be looking at. Is that correct? Okay. What was the vote? 5-0. So that motion to make that adjustment did pass. Let's just do a catch-all motion, just to make sure that we've got things clean. All right, so is there a motion now to make the recommendation to the full board to present what is listed in draft number 9, subject to the revision that was just made, there would be total revenue of 98,254,797, as well as expenditures in the same amount.
So moved.
All right, so we got that motion to make that recommendation by Mr. Pennings. Okay. I'll second that. All right, any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, we're ready to vote.
Please vote no.
I can't see any of the, I can't see any of this stuff.
All right, so that motion does pass on a vote of 5-0. So I think now we have before our full board, we have recommendations on a capital budget, on a GP budget, and a food service budget.
Actually, in the Budget Committee, 4.2, new business,
Okay.
there is a recommendation to revise the food service budget
Okay,
for a
that's what
3%
I was
raise.
going to get to. So
Yes.
that recommendation already went, but I think we, since we did a 3% raise on our GP budget, we need to maybe revise the recommendation that we made on the food service budget. So the food service budget initially that we recommended did not contain a 3% raise.
Correct.
So we've got the, I guess, what would be the proposed revised budget, food service budget, that would include the 3% raise. Is that correct? What's
Yes,
been
sir.
provided to us?
Yes.
All right, so with that, is there a motion to amend that recommendation to the full board that would include the 3% raise to the food service
I
budget?
would make that motion, but I need to ask a question first.
Sure.
Does food service have the money to cover the 3% increase?
Yes? You don't need to get up if it's a yes. Yes,
Yes?
yes.
And I make a motion to amend the budget.
All right, so we got a motion by Mr. Pennings, got a second by Mr. Moore. All right, any discussion on that motion? Ms. Parker?
Just for clarification, as far as the being able to cover it, isn't that through an increase to the costs that we're charging our students?
They'll be using our fund balance that we currently have to cover
Okay.
that cost.
So on the explanation part where it says 10 cents increase for lunch
That was
for
already in
children-
there. That was there from prior.
Okay, so that's not related to this
Correct.
part of it, okay. We're just using fund balance?
That's correct.
And how much total is that gonna mean from your fund balance that you're taking away?
If I remember correctly, I believe it was about $20,000 or $30,000 increase.
Okay. Sounds good, thank you.
I will ask, oh, I won't let you leave just yet. I guess to her point, I know there was some discussion when you brought us the last budget about an increase in the cost because of some other increases. Should this factor into that at all, or are you satisfied leaving the increase that you talked about in the meals at where it is?
I believe we still need to stay where I'm directing to us to go
Okay.
with that increase.
All right, thank you.
All right, any other discussion on the motion? All right, seeing that, we're ready to vote. Okay, that motion does pass. So is there any other business that this committee needs to conduct before we go into the full board session? Do we have all budgets before the board? Okay. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn? All right. Got a motion by Mr. Pennings, second by Mr. Moore. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing that, we're ready to vote. All right, that motion does pass on a vote of 5-0. So that does conclude our budget committee for meetings of 2017. Hopefully don't need to have any more budget committee meetings. I know everybody's worn out. So with that, now we're able to go ahead and we can proceed into our special call meeting so that our board can review the committee's recommendations. But before we get started, does anybody want to take a break? All right, so we're going to let's take a break, and let's come back at 7 o'clock, and we'll go ahead and get started with our special call board meeting.